Very important, the review of the due diligence documentation on the various parties involved. So the review of the personal questionnaires on all the directors, on the investment committee members, on the compliance officer, on the MLRO, on the portfolio managers. You will probably need to send a very interesting tick file to the MFSA with all these due diligence documentation. So just keep in mind that step 2 might take a couple of weeks until you collect all the documentation. My advice to you again is, as much as possible, go to the MFSA with a complete application. They typically get quite pissed off if you go with bits and pieces of paper after you send them this document today, another document the day after, and it's probably better for you to hold off from filing an application until you have a decent pack and you've covered most of the items that you need to give them, so that you can go to the regulator with a very much complete application. To the extent that you don't have the criminal record reports, which might take a couple of weeks in terms of UK or US based clients, it's fine not to file without the criminal record reports, but I wouldn't file an application if I wouldn't have all the PQs, for instance, and the bulk of the due diligence documentation on the shareholders. Because the bulk of the processing time for an application of this type is surely the due diligence and the competence assessment. So making sure that you give that information first is crucial. Once you've drafted them, you would obviously send them to all parties for comments. The business plan would typically be drafted in conjunction with the client because they need to ultimately give you the feedback there. Once you've received comments, and here you probably lost a good 2 weeks, 3 weeks until you collect all the documentation. You file the application under step 4, so you file all the application documents that you've generated. After that, you start working on other documentation, like the director services contracts, like the letters of engagement of the auditors, and documents which you do not need to file with the MFSA. For a fund management application, MFSA needs to see all agreements. Okay, so in terms of management agreements or sub-investment management agreements, they need to see them as part of the review of the manager. If they don't have clients in the pipeline, they need to see specimen agreements. So at the stage, under step 5, the application is with the MFSA. You have some breathing space, so we can start working on the other documentation, which is not MFSA sensitive. And after probably a good 3 to 4 weeks, we will get comments from the MFSA on the application pack. This is where, again, you should expect a letter of between 8 to 10 pages here. So don't worry if it's that long, worry if it's in excess of 12 pages. Okay, so at this stage, after receiving the MFSA comments, we would update all the documentation to reflect the comments. Where we disagree, we will obviously tell them that we don't agree with their conclusion. We discuss matters with the client. We run the revised documents past the client. At this stage, we then proceed with the filing of the revised documentation with the regulator. And again, this is where we have some more breathing space, because after another probably 3 to 4 weeks, and during the next 3 to 4 weeks, you'll probably get a couple of calls or emails from the regulator telling you, why do you disagree with that one? Please do it. No, but so ultimately, you might get a couple of emails or calls from the MFSA where they feel you need to clarify this or clarify that. And after probably a good 3 to 4 weeks, you'll get the in-principle approval, at which stage you incorporate the company and capitalize it. Let's not forget that fund managers must have an initial capital of at least 125,000 euros, so keep that in mind. The next step after we've incorporated the company is to hold the launch board meeting for the fund management company, during which we would approve all the various documentation, including the business plan, the financials, the financial resources statement, the application form, agreements, letters of engagement with the auditors and the tax advisors, the letters of engagement with the auditors, with the legal advisors, discussion on directors and officers liability insurance, which is a very important thing that you need to keep in mind for the launch board meetings of both fund management companies as well as for the funds, in terms of discussions on whether the company should bind the endo cover or PII or a combination of the two. So after this board meeting, again, if you'd have done your fieldwork well, you'd have a pack of documents ready for execution by the directors. We then go ahead and file a final application with the final signed documentation. So you go back with a final signed business plan, final signed financial resources statement, final signed financial projections, and so on and so forth. At this stage, during that week, if you have a fund client in the pipeline, you would obviously sign the contract, but leave it undated. Don't forget that, because you can only date the contract post the license or on the date of the license. But you would typically cover the formalities of getting all the documentation signed. You then get the license, hopefully, and you proceed with the issue, with the dating of all the contracts, and then you're really live, and you can manage your fund. So in terms of the process, the overall process would again take between 10 to 12 weeks. For more complicated structures involving more individuals, it might take a bit longer. Likewise, if the shareholding structure is a bit complicated, it might also end up taking a bit longer for the simple reason that MFSA needs to clear every single person in the structure before they can issue a license. So if you have 3 directors, maybe 3 investment committee members, but only one is not a director, so you're already 4. A compliance officer, 2 portfolio managers, a risk manager. You're easily filing, 8, 9 personal questionnaires at 7 letters each, 7 reference letters each, that's 63 letters. Now, MFSA typically don't wait until they receive all the responses, but they need a great deal of responses before they can sign off a person. So the more complicated the structure, the more qualifying shareholders you have, the more layers you have, the more you risk that it will slip and take more than 12 weeks. So you need to keep that in mind. A simple solution is go ahead with a simple structure and then restructure later. So go ahead with a very plain vanilla shareholding structure, with a plain vanilla operating structure, and then once you're live, you then start adding up personnel and start restructuring the shareholding structure later. But at this stage, you are live and you're managing and raising assets and earning management fees, rather than having to wait until you clear one of the portfolio managers, and that guy might be holding the whole project. So that's a tip that we typically use when we can. Some final concluding remarks. In terms of structuring a fund, the IFMD will surely make our life much more interesting. In terms of making sure, today structuring a PIF is a relatively straightforward process. If you don't have many drawdowns, or the guy wants to invest in a hotel or somewhere and he needs to build it from scratch. And so if the structure is not very complicated, setting up a conventional PIF with a prime broker, a manager, an administrator is relatively straightforward. With the IFMD, it will obviously need to be much more complicated in terms of making sure, because ultimately it will be us which will need to assure the manager that the structure walks and talks like an IFMD compliant structure, in terms of making sure that the controls are there, that the liability provisions in the custody agreement are there, that the controlling arrangements within the prime broker are there. And we need to keep in mind that structuring post the IFMD is going to be trickier. And again, the rules will vary depending on whether you have an EU-based manager or an offshore-based manager, an offshore EU-based manager, because ultimately the IFMD provisions are different for different managers. And then you need to assess whether the manager falls within the de minimis exemption, which is again a different ball game then. So it will always be it will be much trickier, I would say. The risk management function is given much more prominence within the context of the IFMD. It has already been mentioned explicitly even more under UCITS 4, but under the IFMD is given a lot of importance, and I can foresee MFSA putting much more emphasis on making sure that a fund management operation has an independent risk management function. And the same will hold true for self-managed structures. Let's not forget that self-managed PIFs will be regulated like fund managers for the purposes of the IFMD. So again, within the context of self-managed PIFs, we would need to make sure that we also have an independent risk management function. And this might be an issue for certain fund structures. The monitoring duties are also given much more prominence. So again, even MFSA is putting much more emphasis on the monitoring checks that the IC will be undertaking over the delegates or over the portfolio managers, and the actual work of the risk management function and how that integrates with the portfolio managers, with the IC and with the board. Let's not forget that the risk manager always reports to the board and never reports to the IC. So we need to keep that in mind. Similarly, the application process, hopefully not the timeline, will become more complicated, because also at the level of the regulator, in order for them to be able to sign off a structure which is IFMD compliant, they would need to make sure that they are undertaking all the checks and balances in terms of signing off the structure. So I am I wouldn't be surprised if MFSA will start asking for more documentation when filing an application of this type. Hopefully the timelines will stay as they are, which are quite okay generally. That's all I have to tell you.